that's what we're going to bring James S. Snyder to speak to us about today. Please, I welcome to the stage, Mr. James.
Thank you. I might not use it. Let's see if I need, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, good. So, Marcel, thank you for not making me use the microphone. Thank you for not asking me to speak next month when the subject is survival. I'm much happier to speak when the subject is serendipity. And I'm actually very happy to see all of you here. Some of us who are coming here for the first time are very happy always to find initiatives around Jerusalem that are just like this. They exist all over the city. And I'm sure that nearly all of you, maybe all of you, actually feel the creative power of this city and know that when you're out there in the rest of the world and you want to talk about the best place to be in Israel, it is Jerusalem. And if you're in my field, which is about cultural creativity, more and more you feel the sense of young people growing into this field and these disciplines, wanting to tap the creative resource that is Jerusalem. So seeing all of you here this morning is really great. I've not done this before. So Marcel, thank you for getting in touch with me. And I'm glad to hear the things I've heard already from some of you about what you do. And I just want to encourage you to keep finding others like yourselves. There are plenty, not just throughout the city, but throughout the state of Israel. And the ones not yet in the city would have happier and deeper and richer lives if they brought themselves here. So you've got something to do. There's some proselytizing to do. And go right ahead and do it. To talk about serendipity, it's funny, I was thinking, I mean, we all know what serendipity means, but I was trying to think of how to talk about it. And I am pathologically positive, so I never speak in the negative. But the easiest way to talk about serendipity a little bit is Thomas Hardy, the British novelist in the 19th century, that I'm sure everyone has read. If you haven't, the narrative every time is everything's going along fine, and then something terrible happens and everything goes bad. Bad things happen. He called it crass casualty. And it just means that there's like a perfect storm of negativity, bad things happen, end of story. And so it's easy. I mean, serendipity is the opposite of that. Serendipity is kind of the perfect storm that produces a positive result. And so when I thought about how to talk about this for a few minutes, I thought it's very easy. And it's easy for me because somehow my life has mostly been blessed with serendipitous moments, personal ones and professional ones, and even in those occasional brushes with politics, political ones. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about. And sometimes it's nice to use images, sometimes it's not, but I'm going to use a few, if I can do that. There, okay. First, personal serendipity. This is my wife, Tina. We've been married for, it will be 35 years in a few weeks' time. In September 1969, I went off to college. I put my little suitcase down in my little bare room, and someone banged on the door and said, "Reuben, you asshole, open up." I'm not Reuben, but I opened up. And it turned out to be a guy whose name was whose name was Mark Schwader, and we became instantly great friends. And we are still great friends many, many years later. 6 years later, when all of us moved to New York at the same time to do different things, Schwader met the most beautiful girl in New York. And he brought her to a New Year's Eve party. It was New Year's, December 1975, 6 years after he and I first had our first encounter. That would be Tina. Many things then happened. 6 years later, Tina and I had a date. I proposed marriage on our first date. We went on a trip to Spain. And there's Tina, so that's 12 years from the first moment, in the fall of 1981, in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid. And that picture is next to, it's on my bedside side table. So I see it every night when I'm sleeping at home in Jerusalem. 35 years later, being this past year, we were at an Israel Museum moment in Madrid, and we had a whole hour to ourselves. And we turned a corner and discovered that we were in the Plaza Mayor. And I knew exactly where Tina needed to sit so that I could take a picture of Tina exactly in the same pose that she'd been 35 years earlier. This is serendipity, because it tells you that you find a moment of embrace, and 35 years later, it's still the same moment of embrace. And the only thing was, now, I had to enlarge this so that her head was the same size. If you were to shrink it, that tower is that tower. The only thing missing is that guy, who had something to do with the first moment of serendipity. But this is how I think in broad terms about serendipity and its extension into, serendipity is a moment. You have a moment of serendipity, but this is how it extends and becomes part of a contextualized history of, in this case, a life. Here's a guy, I don't even know his name. I can't tell you his name, but he looks like, and I met him in Beverly Hills in California. I've actually been seeing him for 10 years. Every year he turns up at an event of the Israel Museum. He's the companion of the sister of someone who's close to the museum. We say hi. He has a very thick Eastern European accent. We don't really speak very much with each other, but we know each other. But look at him. Where does he looks like he's from? Where does he look like he's from? Somewhere in Eastern Europe. Not quite the Pale of Settlement. He's too colorful for the Pale of Settlement. And last year at this event, Tina and I have a daughter who sometimes shows up at our events worldwide. Lily is very personable. She can talk to a wall. So she started to talk to him. And he speaks in a very heavy Eastern European accent. And Lily, our daughter, said to him, "You sound like you're from Eastern Europe. Where are you from?" And he said, "Oh, I'm from a small town on the Tisa River, just where Czechoslovakia met Romania when I was born." And Lily said, "Oh, that's funny, because my grandmother was from a town on that." And he said, "Oh, you probably don't know the name of the town." And Lily said, "Of course I do. It was Tisa Ulak." And he said, "I was born 3 kilometers from Tisa Ulak." And Lily said, "That's amazing." And then she said, "When did you move to America?" And he told her somewhere in the 1930s. And she said, "Where did you move?" And he said, "Well, I moved to outside of Pittsburgh." And Lily said, "That's amazing. My grandmother moved to outside of Pittsburgh, and so had my grandfather's family. And my grandparents grew up there separately and met there." And he said, "Oh, you probably don't know the name of the towns." And she said, "Of course I do." And she named Charleroi, where my father was from and where his father's business was, and Monessen, where my mother was from, and Belverin, where I grew up. And he said, "You know, this is amazing. I can tell you a story from the summer of 1952. And she's looking at this 90-some-year-old man, and it's like this engaging thing, and I don't even yet know about it. I will in a few minutes' time. And he said, "You know, when I moved to America, and I got to Pittsburgh and lived in McKees Rocks, which was another sort of dismal small town outside of Pittsburgh, and I was in the business of helping people set up clothing plants. And I got sent to Charleroi, Pennsylvania, to set up a plant, took the bus there, did my work. At the end of the day, I didn't have enough money to take the bus back to Pittsburgh. And I went on Main Street, or whatever it was called, and I walked up and down, and I looked for a store that might be owned by a Jew. And he saw Snyder's Furniture. And he went in, and he's telling Lily this, and he said, and there was a really big man with wavy black hair named Bernie. And he said, this guy, I talked to him, and the guy said to me, "You sound like you're from Eastern Europe. Where are you from?" And he said, oh, a small town on the Tisa River between Czechoslovakia and Romania. And Bernie said, that's where my wife is from. And of course, I had the same conversation, but this is 64 years earlier. And my father discovered that this guy was someone nearby, and he drove him back to Pittsburgh, and that was the last they'd ever met. That summer, that guy's son had been born, and a few months earlier, I had been born. And my father passed away several years ago, but this is like to meet a guy that you've known for 10 years and have not been polite enough to talk to, but to have a daughter who speaks to him, who discovers that he knew your father for a brief moment in time and had a distinct memory of your father. This is like a deep and enriching thing about your life that doesn't just affect you, it affects your child. That's serendipity. So those are two stories that are personal. He does look like he's from that little place, right, between Czechoslovakia and Romania. He has that darkness and sadness in his visage, which says something about that. So, that's personal. Professional, of course, or not of course, but some of you may know that I've spent the last 20 years at the Israel Museum. This is a story which is definitionally serendipitous. I grew up in one of those towns that I just mentioned, a dismal industrial town south of Pittsburgh on the Monongahela River, a town where in the region, they mined coal, and they processed coke, and then they made steel. And it was pretty dismal there. Those of you who are mature enough to have seen a film called Deer Hunter many years ago, that town, our town was like that town. It wasn't pretty. And yet somehow, when I grew up there, I knew as a small kid that if you walked away from the town and went up into the hills above the town, I didn't know then that you were talking about revealing context. But I knew that if I just went up on the hill behind our house, I saw a very beautiful river valley. And it was blighted right by the river. But if you just went above it, you were seeing another landscape. And you were seeing another story. And, you know, I was about 8 years old. But still, I didn't know these words, but I realized that I was looking under the moment and seeing the landscape. And then, interestingly, a tributary of the Monongahela River is the Youghiogheny River. Now, who knows what great American modernist architectural masterpiece is on the Youghiogheny River?
Falling water?
Yes, who said that? Stand up. So, I didn't know what Falling Water was. I didn't know who Frank Lloyd Wright was. But the place to go to do the rapids, such as they were around us, was the little tributary of the Youghiogheny River where Falling Water was built. And from the age of 8, because before 8 you weren't allowed to go there, but from 8 until 14 when I was sent away to school, every summer I would go to this place and I'd look at this piece of architecture and I would think, and I didn't know these terms, but I saw a building sitting in the landscape, and I saw what happened when you put architecture in the landscape and how powerful it could be. Then when I was 14, I got sent away to a boarding school that was in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. All the boys hated it, but I loved it. And I loved it because the landscape was gorgeous, and all the architecture was built right before the Civil War. Fieldstone bases, Pennsylvania brick facades, and the connection between that architecture and that landscape sang. It said something to you. It told you about the history of a certain moment. It told you about yourself today looking back at that, and it told you about the landscape underneath. And then if you jump ahead, when I finished school and I went to New York, and I went to work at the Museum of Modern Art, and of course the Museum of Modern Art is like the temple to international modernism. And it's all about the notion of building architecture that sits in a place and where you have a resonance between the place and the architecture, and where you know that it's not about the architecture, it's about architecture as the neutral backdrop for a story that you tell inside. And I was a very happy person at the Museum of Modern Art. I was there for 22 years. I had the privilege of helping to remake it in one of its major iterations in its own history. And my own field was 1850 and later, and what happened in the middle of the 19th century that suddenly allowed for a change in the visual cultural narrative, that it moved away from the representational and it moved away from always telling a moral story, and it became about something else. It became about visual aesthetics, and it would grow into the story of international modernism. And I became a diehard international modernist junkie, and I was perfectly happy. And in a way, I was kind of addicted to what that ethos was about. And then suddenly, out of the blue, in the spring of 1996, I was asked if I might want to be the director of the Israel Museum. Some of you know that I had to look on the map to see where Israel was. I knew about that museum only that it had a very strong modern and contemporary art collection. Those are my fields. But that it was those collections were in an encyclopedic setting so that you could start to give context to 1850 and later. I knew nothing about what the place looked like. I knew nothing about the sense of it, and I came to see it. And this isn't exactly what I saw, because this is how the museum looks today after we renewed it, but it wanted to look like this, and the bones of this existed then. And just arriving, I arrived here at the end of the day. It wasn't lighted so uniformly. It was lighted with a lot of lights that wanted to be uniform, but I knew they could be. And what I saw was like international modernism as an outcropping of architecture on a stunning landscape. And it made me think of everything else that had affected me in my life before, and I thought there might be something here. Now, this is not spontaneity, what you see here, because soon I would learn that Alfred Mansfeld, the architect who designed the museum, who was born in St. Petersburg, trained in Germany in international modernism, came to Palestine to bring an international modernist language and adapt it to the landscape of the new Israel, had in mind to think about an Arab village on a Jerusalem hillside and to reinterpret it through a vocabulary of international modular modernism into what would become the Israel Museum, and that's it in 1968. On that hillside. So this wasn't spontaneous. This was analytical. But the end result is something spontaneous, which you saw in the image that we left. And what happened the next morning was that I came to the museum, and again, this promenade didn't exactly look like this. In 1996, it wanted to look like this. And as I ascended this promenade and got not where the guy is with the hat, but one more higher, I knew that I was hooked, because as an international modernist junkie, my knees were shaking from the beauty of this place and the idea, and this was spontaneous, because Teddy Kollek, who envisioned this, didn't know nothing about any of this. But here I was on a site which used international modernism to lay an architectural vocabulary and an envelope on a powerful landscape, and once you entered, it would become the backdrop for telling a narrative which then didn't exist, but all of the material needed to make it happen was within there, and allowed us over time to make what you know there today, which is the backdrop for a story that starts 1.5 million years ago and comes to the present, and that relates to the mantra that all things connect over time and around the globe. Now, as I say, in 1960, Teddy Kollek wasn't thinking about all that, but somehow inspiration and spontaneity and a perfect storm of positive connection enabled the groundwork for that, and made me realize in 1996 that without knowing a thing about this place, we should pick up that family of ours and just move here and try to get that place from there to what it wanted to be. With a lot of help from a lot of people and an incredible staff in our Israel Museum, and I hope you know many of them, we have been able to do that. And so the springboard was spontaneity. What followed was everything else that spontaneity inspires. So that's personal and that's professional. Now, political, but not political, because of course we are not about politics in our place. And the more of us who aren't about politics, the greater success we can have from our part of the world, and the more we can flourish in a contextual connection with everything else in the rest of the world. Some of you might remember that finally, some here said finally, I didn't matter when it happened, but some said finally, President Obama came for a state visit to Israel. Some said he should have done it, he should have done it, but finally he came, and here is the idea of like the perfect storm that produces an unbelievably positive result. Someone about whom there were mixed feelings, which I think now have dissipated actually worldwide. Everyone remembers this man with great fondness. But in this moment of coming to Israel, with a lot of suspicion about his motives, this man chose to spend 2 hours at the Israel Museum and chose on his own quietly to spend an hour understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Shrine of the Book. Now, everybody goes to see the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Shrine of the Book. Heads of state do it all the time, and they have the attention span of a mosquito, which means about a nanosecond. And this man, for an hour, absorbed the story of how, if you look at the Isaiah scroll, you're looking at something that is foundational to Jewish theology, but really is the springboard for Christian theology. And for Orthodox Christians, it's like the fifth gospel, because it gives you the narrative of destruction and resurrection. And it gives you an inkling of the notion of God inside yourself, of God inside man. And he also had the attention span long enough to be ready to hear the story about how this would be a springboard for Islam a few centuries later. And when we finished telling that story, and there was, nothing, there was no agenda to our being together. It was just about all of this coming together at this one moment and producing a pretty revelatory result. And the result was his going like this and saying, I understand this, and it is very meaningful. And this is the moment on the way out. This doesn't happen very often. And why is this spontaneity? Because any diplomatic visit here would have taken any of 10 other itineraries through the course of those 46 hours. But he somehow wanted that moment to happen. And look how it allowed something that might have been political instead to become something with huge and deep cultural meaning. An exciting moment. After that, it made me start to think about how, in what we do, it really isn't about politics of the moment or geopolitics generally or geopolitical history. It's about the landscape under all of that political movement of the moment. And it made me realize that what's important, not just for the Israel Museum, but for museums everywhere, is to use the cultural material that they have, the stuff that goes under geopolitics, to the landscape and what's under the landscape, what built the landscape, to tell stories. And they can be stories from the past that talk to you about the present, or they can be stories in the present moment that amplify and illuminate what's happening in the present. So I'll just show you two examples. I hope all of you saw this beautiful small exhibition a year and a half ago. of the only 3 bronze portrait busts of Hadrian that survived from the time of his empire. You didn't all see it?
Yeah.
If you didn't see it, you missed something amazing. It's only 3 things. And you know, we brought these 3 things together because the museum had turned 50 and we had many ideas that we implemented. And one simple idea was that for each of the collecting wings of the museum, the fine arts, Jewish world culture, and archaeology, we would take an object or 2 from our own collections and pair or trio those objects with loans from sister institutions as tributes to the Israel Museum on the occasion of its 50th anniversary. In this case, I hope you all know that of the only 3 bronze portrait busts of Hadrian that survived from his time, the most beautiful one is our own. Now, you know, in Israel, they say that all the time, our cows give more milk and all that stuff. But in this case, it happens that the one in the middle, which is ours, which was excavated only about 25 years ago in Beit Shan, is the most beautiful. Because the aesthetics of where we are today really were at the core of the aesthetics of the classic Roman aesthetic vocabulary. So this is the best one. The other 2, the one on the left comes from the British Museum in London. The one on the right comes from the Louvre in Paris. And we weren't even thinking about what I'm about to tell you. We were just reacting spontaneously to the opportunity, knowing that we had one, that the British Museum and the Louvre are friends of the Israel Museum, and that they would lend these to us. And here we would have a nice statement of tribute from sister institutions that we like to think are in our league, to us on the occasion of the anniversary by allowing us, for the first time, to put these 3 bronze portrait busts together. They came, we put them in place, and we started to realize the message, the deep meaning that that little sort of curatorial spontaneity brought together. And the meaning is this. Hadrian, of course, ruled the broadest expanse of the Roman Empire, from Iraq to Great Britain. And he ruled it during its golden moment, during its best and most peaceable moment. These 3 heads are fascinating for us because they're the same guy. These heads were all always sculpted from the same model. But depending on who was interpreting the visual attributes of the model, which was just a profile on a coin, he looked different. So the one from the British Museum was done way at the western edge of the empire by people living in Britain at the time. And it's an entirely different aesthetic. Maybe it looks like the people who lived there, but it doesn't look like the people who lived and had a visual dictionary for creating these portrait busts here. And it didn't look like the one from the Louvre comes from Asia Minor, comes from somewhere in Turkey. And again, it's a different visual aspect. And we started to think about that, and it was its own sort of first level of enlightening interpretation. And it was about the idea that you can have people in an empire all across the empire, but they represent different ethnicities. Those ethnicities have a different visual sensibility. They have a different aesthetic culture, and they are all one. They lived in a golden time, in a peaceable time, and yet they depicted that emperor according to their own sensibility from their own subculture. Now, if you think of what's happening in the world today, that's like a really interesting message, because what's happening in the world today that has really shaken the world is happening exactly across the same landmass from Iraq to Great Britain. And here we're telling a story that in 130 AD, people lived peaceably across that landmass, using different languages, different vocabularies, and seeing things differently. And of course, for us locally, the footnote to this story is that 5 years later, having said that he was prepared to rebuild the Second Temple, somehow something changed Hadrian's mind, and he returned, killed 600,000 Judeans, expunged Jerusalem, and erased Jerusalem and Judea from the world map. That's a different story. But again, these are stories that take from this cultural material from the past and sort of help you think about something that's happening in your own time. And you know, in our group of museum directors, we talk about this all the time now, because people say, you know, museums are becoming less and less relevant. The truth is, the more museums hold these kinds of treasures, and our curatorial spontaneity enables us to do this, the better it is. Now, to come to a story of the moment, and this is not a promotion for the exhibition Ai Weiwei, Maybe, Maybe Not, which is opening 2 weeks from today at the Israel Museum. This is a story about spontaneity. You all know who Ai Weiwei is? Okay. So after his period of arrest in China, when China loosened its stranglehold again, I think for practical reasons, knowing that it would be hard to do business in the West if they continued to hold Ai Weiwei under arrest. So they released him. He lives freely in China, but he's chosen to live mostly in Berlin because he has better gallery support, studio support, and he can work worldwide. Is he a great artist? I'm not sure, but he may be the greatest artist of the moment because his focus is on the condition of humankind today. His focus is on humanity and the state of humanity. This is sort of an iconic image of him looking out at the world. But here, almost exactly a year ago, sort of in the middle of May, he is filming, he's working on a multi-year project on refugee migration, which is a film project. He's traveling to all of the locations across, really across the same landmass that we mentioned with regard to Hadrian, and he's filming, and he was in the West Bank, and I had a phone call on a Thursday saying that on Friday morning at 10 o'clock, an hour and 20 minutes ago, he wanted to come and see the Israel Museum. He would have an hour and a half. Could I do it? And I said, of course I'll do it. And I got there at 10 o'clock. And at 11:30, he hadn't arrived. And we thought, well, he's blown us off. He's not the man we thought he was or hoped he was. At 11:30, he arrived. And his whole entourage was shouting, Weiwei, we're late, we're late. We have to go see this and that, and we have to be at the airport because our plane is at 4. We have to leave at 2 o'clock. And he said, I came to see the Israel Museum, and we are staying here for an hour and a half, and then we're going to the airport. For the next hour and a half, we saw the entire Israel Museum. We saw this entire story from 1.5 million years ago to the present, and I explained this mantra about how all things connect across time and around the globe. He's like a social media junkie, so he was Instagramming and doing all that stuff. As we went, and all over the world, people were seeing this, and my phones were buzzing away in my pocket because everyone was watching this happen. 3 months later, Weiwei, through an intermediary, reached me to say that he'd been so moved by the experience of this place that with all the museums lined up with commitments for exhibitions, if we would give him certain dates and certain space, he would do an exhibition with us. And we were already planning, this isn't serendipity, this is planning. We were planning a season just now of art and artists in our time because we already, based on Hadrian and other stories, realized that we wanted to do a season of exhibitions where artists' messages were meaningful for the moment. Not politically, but as a form of enlightenment. And so we thought having Weiwei in that constellation of artists would elevate it in a dramatic way. So we offered June 1st, 2017, and we offered space, the entire top floor of the museum. And he said he was willing to work on it. On November 4th, we met in New York for 4 hours. We had an incredible discussion, which for him sort of started with the kind of political focus that has been on his mind in recent times, but for us started with the point that we're not about politics, we're about these subliminal messages that help you understand the moment in which you live. And we came finally to a narrative which is about the people of China and the people who live in Israel, all of them, all the people who live in Israel, and the way that they are the current manifestation of 5,000-year-long cultures, single cultural heritage, single language, bracketing Asia with sensibilities that resonate. He lived in New York in the 1980s and for some reason lived on the Upper West Side, so he went back to China with the idea that everyone in New York was Jewish. And back in China, it is true in China, there's this amazing thing a mystical thing between the Chinese and people in Israel, because they're very similar. Their value systems are similar. They believe in family, education, and hygiene. They are generous in the ways that they can be. And the Chinese have a great admiration for people here, but they don't understand that there are so few. And people here, you all know, have great admiration now for China, and no one here can count to 1 billion, let alone 3 billion. So the understanding of who lives there, it's like a mystery, but it's an engagement and it's a fascination. And so this began with spontaneity, with Weiwei. It continues at the moment. On Sunday night at midnight, I had a little email from Weiwei saying, I welcome you to my studio at 11 a.m. on Tuesday in Berlin. And you know, I sort of have a schedule. But I knew that this was not a moment to like say, I'm busy. And I left the next night and I got there and had the most amazing 5 hours that I've perhaps ever had in my life, sitting across from an artist, having a discussion so deep and so personal, at the end of which he said that he really came on the spur of the moment to see this place, knowing only a little bit about it, but he left with a sense of conviction about the importance of the story that we have here. So, again, spontaneity is what it is, but it's a positive, and it leads to other things that can be deep, meaningful, and not of the moment. And so in 2 weeks' time, actually, we are opening this amazing exhibition. Why won't we go to the last? We're opening this amazing exhibition. It's a sequence of monumentally scaled metaphorical installations by Weiwei, where the theme of each metaphor is something that means something to people in China and it means something to people here. The first one is easy because it's sunflower seeds, and you all know about his sunflower seeds, millions and millions of them, each handmade, each of porcelain, hand-painted. And they've been shown before, but they've never been shown in a place where it's about the people in China who eat them and spit out the husks, and all the people who live in Israel who eat them and spit out the husks. And you know, he does this incredible thing with wooden trees. And in China, wooden trees, dead wooden tree fragments are about retaining the spirit of those who preceded you. Here, the story of the tree is really related to the olive tree, and it goes back to how old olive trees can be, and the notion of sort of the immortality of olive trees and their connection to Jesus in the Valley of the Cross, next to the Israel Museum, and the notion of the wood of the true cross that may have come from an olive tree in that Valley of the Cross. So we're doing a huge grove of those olive trees inside. And outside, for the first time, he's produced 3 trees cast in iron, really monumental in scale. These are like 28 feet wide and each weighs 14 tons. And they've never been shown before. The first time they will be shown is here on our campus, and of course connected to the shrine of the book, not spontaneity, careful thinking about where to place them so that this iconic moment is forever indelibly etched in everyone's mind relating to the landscape and architecture of where they are. These are already in place, and you should come and see them. But it's only to end with the point that spontaneity is like great and amazing. The flip side, crass casualty, is something you want to stay away from, but that part's not up to you. Nor is spontaneity up to you. But when spontaneity, with all of its positive radiance, strikes you, seize the moment and use it, because from it you can do something good.
Do you have to go, or can you do some questions?
We can do some questions.
All right, James actually has to run, but we have time for 3 questions. Are you ready?
There are none. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to mention that I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I knew what you were talking about.
Did you ever go to Falling Water?
I actually did not have a chance, but I'm hoping to at some point.
You still can and you should. Actually, you know what? It's a funny thing. Only like in the last several years after we finished rebuilding the museum, and I've always thought why it mattered so much to me to think about the power of the connection between landscape and architecture as backdrop and setting for telling a story. And I realized that it goes back to being a kid and going to Falling Water, not even knowing what it was, but being struck by its power.
How would you describe the influence that Israel has on the contemporary current art scene?
In the rest of the world?
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's really interesting, and I don't want to say that it's because of the Israel Museum, but a little bit I might. Because artists everywhere are willful. And no matter how much their gallerists try to edit them and sort of present the best of their work, it's very hard. And out in the rest of the world, you got a lot of galleries and gallerists who are that strong. Here we have a lot of artists, and many are very good, but we don't have so many editors of their work so that the best work is what goes out in the world. And I'm not like beating the drum for the Israel Museum, but we have a great Israeli art department, and we do that kind of editing. And when we show work, it gets attention. You know, someone asked me about being at the Venice Biennale last week. I didn't go because we're going with a group of our supporters and our own curators in the fall when it's quieter. But we curated an exhibition at an off-site venue called the Palazzo Chiarini Stampaglia, and it's actually a young Jewish Orthodox woman artist from Jerusalem named Hadassah Goldwicht. Who knows Hadassah? You do, but who else? She is one great artist, and we have worked with her on a few projects, and her gallery in New York came to us and said, so you have to have an institutional sponsor, and I said, not only that, we'll curate the show because we know and love her work. And she's done a work in this palazzo, which is the end of a 3-year investigation of and process of interviewing Jews living in the ghetto in Venice. It was sort of a 500th anniversary of the Ghetto Project, and sort of focusing in on the 70-something-year-old Jewish guy who is the caretaker of the cemetery. It's very beautiful, it's very lyrical, and all the valley opened, and you know, you have the official national pavilions, and then you have now an equal number of off-site projects, and she was listed among the 5 best of the off-site projects by the Financial Times in London, and the New York Times picked her as one of the few off-sites about whom they'll do a feature. So there is great art here. It's a question of editing and presenting so that people out in the rest of the world get it.
Last question?
The question is, why is why is so difficult to find Marc Chagall's art in the Israel Museum?
Why is it so difficult to find?
Marc Chagall art in Israel Museum. I know it is, but it's difficult to find it.
You know what? I'll tell you, we have a lot of Chagall, and we send big Chagall exhibitions out all over the world. But remember, the Israel Museum, you know, we have 225,000 square feet of galleries. Most museums, even the grand ones, don't have that much gallery space. And we have to tell 1.5 million years of a story in 225,000 square feet. So Marc Chagall is in there always with a few very important works, but in the scheme of 1.5 million years, he's got a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.